You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Hello everyone and welcome to episode 2 of season 2 of ADHD BCE. In this episode we're following on from last time where we explored the universal nature of the human nervous system and how all people at all times have been directed by their own experiences within their own environments, leading to a rich and complex past that we're now only just starting to figure out. And in today's episode we're exploring how archaeology is endeavouring to understand our shared story through what's physically left in the archaeological record, aka the ground. For neurodivergent listeners, this is the episode that will hopefully help you understand how archaeology works so that when anyone asks you why you're super proud of your differences, you can reference all the hard work archaeology is doing. I'm delighted to welcome the one and only Professor Duncan Garrow, who's going to talk to us about how he and other archaeologists are able to tell so much about our past from the relatively tiny amount of remains uncovered in the excavations. Duncan is a professor of archaeology at the University of Reading and has worked extensively on prehistoric Britain and Ireland, particularly the Neolithic period. He's also excavated and researched some remarkable sites, including the famous artificial Neolithic island in the Outer Hebrides, site that has radically changed our understanding of prehistoric monumentality and ritual activity in Britain. Duncan's work often explores how people in the past interacted with objects, landscapes, and each other, and how archaeologists interpret meaning from the fragments that survive in the archaeological record. Duncan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, and thank you for that excellent introduction.
My pleasure, Duncan. Duncan, before we dive into the archaeological record itself, would you mind telling us a little bit about how you first became interested in archaeology and how your interests developed into the areas of research you're working on today?
Of course, yeah. So I was lucky enough to go with my family to an amazing site called Ephesus in Turkey with remarkable upstanding archaeology, and I was just blown away with the fact that I could walk around an ancient Roman town. And that really sparked my interest, first of all, when I was a teenager. And then at school, I guess I was really interested in history, but I didn't think I wanted to study history at university necessarily. Obviously, archaeology is quite close to history, but what really appealed to me was the outdoor nature of archaeology and also the fact that it was just a bit more kind of practical and hands-on. And so that element combined with a kind of historical interest made me think, oh, maybe I'll give archaeology a go, a little bit randomly, but it seems to have worked out, and I'm still doing archaeology, luckily enough for me, however many decades later it is.
So you were a teenager. That's a similar age to when I got into archaeology, actually. That's interesting.
Yeah, I think, maybe lots of people get into it, and that's when you begin to start thinking about what might I want to do. And I'm not sure I ever thought I wanted to be an archaeologist at that time, but one thing led to another, and as I studied it at university, I realised that I really did enjoy it and kept going.
Lucky for us.
Yeah, maybe, yeah.
So what are you working on at the minute?
Well, that's a very good question. I've literally just finally, after many years, handed in a book manuscript which is looking at ritual deposition in prehistoric Britain, something I've worked on in various ways over the years. So that's been a brilliant thing to have got finished. Well, I don't know if it's brilliant, but it's brilliant for me to have finished it last week. Book coming out before too long, hopefully in time for everyone's Christmas presents. And otherwise, I'm writing up our work that you mentioned in the introduction on Neolithic cranog in the Outer Hebrides with my long-term collaborator Fraser Sturt and Stephanie Blankshine, who's been working on the project with us as well. So that's what we turn to next, and that's really exciting.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on the book as well. That's very
exciting.
Thank
you. Yeah.
Great stuff. All right then, Duncan. Well, let's have a little think about how we're doing this. It's the tiny fraction of the past that survives. I mean, one thing that's always fascinated me about archaeology is that you're essentially trying to reconstruct entire worlds from a very small number of surviving clues. Most of the things people used in the past were made of organic materials like wood, fibres, leather, plant material, and so on. Things that simply don't survive well in the ground. So in many ways, archaeologists are reconstructing entire cultures from what must be a tiny fraction of what once existed. Duncan, how much of the past do you think actually survives in the archaeological record? And when archaeologists excavate a site, what kind of materials or traces are most likely to survive for us to find often thousands of years later?
Yeah, good question. So you're absolutely right about all the organics that you mentioned, which would just rot away unless they're in an anaerobic environment. So we can get good survival of things like wood and textile. Quite often it's in watery environments where the bacteria that eat those things can't survive. But most of the sites that we dig, of course, aren't underwater. So the kinds of material that I'm looking at in prehistory will be mostly pottery, and quite often flint and stone, flint tools and things like that. And then as you get into the later periods, the Bronze Age and Iron Age, as their names imply, you're going to get some metals, although they're surprisingly rare. When you dig a Bronze Age site, it's not often you find some bronze. So there's that problem that you identify, the things that survive easily and the things that don't. And then, of course, the second problem on top of that is whether things got deposited in the ground in the first place. And obviously a lot of in order to survive at all, things have to be buried in environments that they survive. So if people dug a rubbish pit, the material might be surviving in there, whereas if they just left it in a pile on top of the surface of the ground, what we might call a midden, a kind of compost heap thing, all of that would have much less chance of surviving. So it's the materials that things are made from, and then the way in which they were dealt with by, in my case, prehistoric people, that also affects what you have to kind of the jigsaw pieces that you have to create a picture of the past. I'm thinking you're wanting me to put a number on it, which is tricky, very tricky.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but I'd get, let's say, really, like, you've got to imagine something like 1%. Let's pluck that figure out of the air, because as you said, so much percentage of stuff just won't survive, and then let's say half of the stuff that people had wouldn't survive, and then most of that second half that might survive that didn't necessarily get placed in the ground in a way that we can then dig it up as archaeologists, basically.
Yeah, sure. So basically, the chances of most items surviving is nigh on impossible. Yeah, highly unlikely. Sure. Well,
Yeah.
So then, obviously, we're picking up, a fraction of a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. So, I mean, this is something that's always amazed me when we watch archaeologists on excavations, is what they can look at. When we're watching an excavation, is what archaeologists, to most people, would look just like dirt. So obviously very few material remains. So we're looking at context, I suppose is the term. And we can get from that an extraordinary amount of information. Perhaps a slight change in soil colour, a patch of darker earth, a cluster of stones, or a scatter of artefacts, if we're lucky, can reveal something that happened there in that point thousands of years ago. Duncan, could you talk us through how archaeologists actually sort of read the ground? What kind of clues are you looking for when you're excavating a site? And why is the context of an object, where it's found, that is, and how it's positioned, often more important than the object itself?
Yeah, good question. You're making me smile because you're reminding me of Fraser, who I always work with. His partner Anna, who's a physicist, came out to visit us when we were digging in Guernsey way back when. And Anna, archaeology was new to Anna, let's put it that way. And she said one evening, I can't believe there's so many people that are so interested in soil, which was very funny because we spent a lot of the time on site debating different colours of soil, as you're alluding to. So I'll try and give people a picture on a podcast in terms of, let's imagine you have a nice clear subsoil like chalk. So you've got a kind of white rock. And if people are, let's say they're digging a ditch to make a field, or they might be digging a ditch around the settlement where they live. So they cut into that white chalk and they dig some of it out. It's quite hard digging chalk, but they could manage it with antler picks and things. And then gradually, over time, if that settlement got abandoned, the ditch that they've cut into the white chalk would not get filled in with clean white chalk. it would get filled in with the soil in the topsoil that's mixed up with that. So it tends to look, everyone can hopefully imagine topsoil, it just looks kind of like brown and muddy, and that will fill in the ditch. And so if you were to open up a big area with a digger, like we often do in archaeology, or even by hand, you'd see these kind of stripes that are filled in ditches. So on a chalky site, you'd see the white chalk where no one's dug into it, and then you'd see the kind of traces of ditches and maybe post holes which people have dug to put the posts to build a house in, that kind of thing. They've all then filled up with brown soil. So you can see this kind of template that shows you where the houses and the fields and the burial monuments and things like that were. So that's the first thing. So none of that's really artifacts or finds. That's actually the what we would call in archaeology the features. And then, of course, once you think, oh, we've got a house, you might then excavate the features. So you'd excavate the brown, muddy soil, and out of that would come the pottery and the flint and other things that we've been talking about earlier. And that's when you'd begin to think, okay, so what did they have in this part of the house, and what did they have in that part of the house, and that kind of idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's a great answer. That really helps. Basically, what we're seeing there is human activity, what was going on in terms of groundworks and activity in that sense. So that kind of leads on to, from that, I suppose, to interpretations. So once archaeologists uncover something, whether it's a structure, a burial, a deposit of objects, there's then this fascinating moment when the physical evidence has to be interpreted. And interpretation is where archaeology, I guess, becomes both scientific and imaginative at the same time. Duncan, how do archaeologists move from the physical evidence in the ground to interpreting what people were actually, and how confident are archaeologists, or can archaeologists be in those interpretations, and how do interpretations change as new discoveries are made?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that generally speaking, as archaeologists, we're never really certain. And I think if we're certain, we're doing something wrong, because we're not there to watch what happened. And we can't generally talk to the people that created that archaeology in the first place. So what we're trying to do really is to look at the evidence, much like someone working as a detective in the police force or investigating a crime scene in the modern world. You look at the evidence and you try and create a convincing interpretation, or, as I think you said, a story about what happened. And the convincingness of that story is partly based on all of the other archaeology that's been found before then. So it might look like something that we've seen before. Maybe it looks like the kind of house that we often see in the Bronze Age, that's round in shape rather than square. And from that, you begin to say, okay, that's a house. And people can see where the posts were, and sometimes people have even made reconstructions of houses in the modern day based on the archaeological evidence, so you can see that they work. So you build up an interpretation based on what you know already, what you can see in front of you, and you try and make it convincing. But we're never really going to know. We might find a burial with grave goods in it, but we're never really truly going to know why people put those grave goods in there. But we can make up some interesting interpretations, or what are really stories, to try and explain that to people.
Yeah, interestingly, last night I sat down with my kids, and there was an archaeology program. It was on Channel 5, so disclaimer. But it was on the Ultrastone at Stonehenge, and how they discovered that it was transported somehow from Orkney all the way down to Stonehenge, and then they compared the local site to Stonehenge Durrington Walls with the houses on Bray, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, sure, and how similar they are. But of course, there was some leaps taken in there where, they must have known each other, and so on. But it's interesting for neurodivergent listeners as well. There's one of the beautiful parts of archaeology is pattern seeking, which we were notoriously good for. But the danger being jumping to conclusions, I guess.
Yeah, and we're always trying to look for pattern, because in a way, pattern is almost what tells you how people acted. And sometimes you can see one-off events, but in a way, to understand that past society, you want to see lots of different events that tell you, okay, when people buried people in the Bronze Age, they liked putting a pot in the grave, and you could guess that from the base of one grave, but if you see it in hundreds of graves, you know that was a kind of society-wide practice. So you begin to be able to say bigger things about the past and what everyone was like rather than one individual person was like, kind of thing, and both of those things are important, but you need both to properly understand the past, I think.
Yeah, so I guess the point is as well that we're still working on from interpreting from what has been discovered so far and how those remains and artefacts and so on relate to each other. But we still have the problem that we've probably got entire landscapes that have disappeared, cultures and stories that are still waiting to be discovered. So we're not actually getting anywhere near the full picture anyway, are we?
That's right, yeah. And it never ceased to amaze me when I worked as an archaeologist ahead of developments that were happening, that you'd just turn up in a nice rural field and then there'd be this amazing site there that no one ever knew was even there. And it never ceased to amaze me how much archaeology there remains to be found. It's great, luckily for us as archaeologists.
Exactly. We're not going to run out of work anytime soon.
Hopefully not.
Okay, Duncan. Well, let's move on to human behaviour in the archaeological record. I mean, as I said, in the previous episode, we talked about the evolution of the human nervous system and this idea that long before written history, people already had the same kind of brains and cognitive capacities that we have today. And of course, archaeology can't diagnose individuals in the past. We can't put anything from our time back onto their time. And I guess, but it can show us archaeology can, and the evidence that we've got so far can show us variation in behaviour, in innovation, experimentation, creativity, and sometimes unusual or unexpected practices. Duncan, do you think the archaeological record shows evidence of different kinds of thinking or behaviour among past populations? Are there moments where archaeologists can clearly see innovation or individuals doing something unexpected?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's quite hard to see an individual in the archaeological record, as we kind of touched on before. And really, you might see it in a moment of flint napping if you've got really nicely preserved evidence that's just sitting there from thousands of years ago, if you're lucky. And in a way, the best way to see individuals is in burials, because there you actually have the person and you have sometimes if you're lucky, you have some grave goods with them as well. And from the basis of those grave goods, you've always got to remember that the person in the grave didn't put those grave goods in. It was the people that were burying that person. So it's always a little bit complicated, because they might have put things in that reflected their own feelings towards that person. They weren't necessarily just things that showed what that person was. So it is really hard to see the individual unless you're lucky. But we certainly see kind of tendencies in the past of actions and behaviours that seem very unusual to us in the modern day. And that's one of the things that's fascinating about archaeology, when you realise that people just do things differently to what we think is normal in the modern world. But back then it was perfectly normal, and that's a really important realisation for us in the present day, I think, to remember that we're not necessarily right, and we're not necessarily normal in inverted commas. We're just as different as all sorts of people have been in the past and will be in the future. I hope that kind of answers your question.
No, that's great, Duncan. And I suppose broadly speak, I mean, we could go really philosophical here. I mean, for neurodivergent listeners who perhaps come on this podcast to try and learn a bit more about their differences or their story, in terms of archaeology, then we could say that I could ask for them, why does archaeology matter, and why should people care about what lies beneath their feet, or what does archaeology give us in terms of understanding humanity and our shared past?
Yeah, in a way, I think my first answer would be what I said in my previous answer to that, is that I think it's really important for us as a society today to realise that even under our feet, in the same space, almost the same space that we occupy now, different ways of being and different ways of living and different ways of thinking about the world were possible and really totally valid. And we have to realise that our place on Earth and our worldview is also quite transient and will be totally different in 100 years' time, or even 10 years' time in some cases. So I think that's one of the main reasons why I think archaeology is important for the modern world. I also think it's important because, firstly, because lots of people enjoy finding out about the past just on that basis, and you can never dig a site and have an open day and people not be interested, which is always a really nice thing about being an archaeologist, because people just do find it interesting, and I think that's a valid reason for doing it in itself. And then there's the more kind of deep answer about, we have to, in order to understand today's world, we have to understand how we got here, which is certainly, of course, absolutely 100% true. And some people might think of that answer being relative to, let's say, the Second World War or what happened in the 1980s or something like that. And that's true too. But the logical kind of extent of that is that we just have to go back as far as we can, and as far back in time and as far back through humanity's past as we can as well, because they're all steps along the road to today. So I think archaeology is really important in that way as well.
I completely agree, Duncan. That's a great answer. Fantastic. If we could go back to one of your specialist areas, the Neolithic period. People might not know this, but it was a hugely pivotal moment in the human story. And the period itself often appears incredibly creative in the archaeological record: monuments, deposits, ritual landscape. And what do you think was driving the explosion of activity? And if you wouldn't mind actually framing the time scale of this as well. Yeah, that was a really poorly put question.
No, that's all right. So the Neolithic, which just means New Stone Age, it's quite an old terminology. So it was originally about the kinds of stone that you found. But since then, it's acquired all sorts of other things. So farming is the main one. So when we first had domesticated animals and crops, as opposed to hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. So that happens around about 9,000 or 10,000 years ago in Southwest Asia, around about Syria, Jordan, Turkey, Iran, that part of the world. And then the idea of farming, along with pottery and maybe living in more permanent settlements, kind of spreads out from there and in the direction of Britain, where I'm based and where lots of my research is related to. The Neolithic arrives from across the Channel around about 4000 BC, so 6,000 years ago. And that does, as you said, involve a dramatic transformation of the world, really. And we now know from ancient DNA, from the genetics, that the reason the Neolithic arrived in Britain and Ireland was probably because people moved from the near continent and they brought with them the cows and the sheep and the wheat and the barley that they needed to farm with. But they also brought with them ideas about building large monuments, sometimes at the landscape scale, as you mentioned. So in Britain, we see the beginning of big long barrows being built, so massive burial mounds, and big causewayed enclosures, so big gathering sites that they'd marked with the kind of ditches that we were talking about earlier. So that's what happens, and that's the kind of time scale. I think that answered your question.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. In my head, when you talk about it wasn't an idea necessarily that spread, but population, and that they brought the crops and the animals with them. In my head, I was thinking, how did they get the cows on the boats?
That's a very good question. And Fraser, who I've already mentioned, he's done a lot of maritime archaeology. He collects pictures of cows in boats, which is always quite amusing, but not so much in written form. But sometimes they're very scary-looking pictures of a massive cow on a very small boat. But it's a really good point, and it's likely that cows can swim across water, but it's most likely across something like the Channel that the boats would have been relatively small, we think, at that time. It's slight speculation because we don't have clear boats until around about 4,000 years ago. But in the Neolithic, we think they probably had fairly small, fairly unsturdy boats, and so it's most likely that they would have brought the cows in baby form across, so it would have been much easier, of course, and safer to bring calves. But it's still quite an amazing feat to imagine, and they would have necessarily needed quite a lot of them to begin a kind of viable breeding population. And it's one of those processes that must have happened, and you know it's happened, but you still find it quite hard to grasp as an archaeologist, the actual practicalities of it happening, if you know what I mean. So it's a really good point.
Yeah. I mean, it is fascinating, isn't it? And this, whenever in any archaeological context, there's always a little moment for me when I get this reassurance that people we've got these nervous systems, we've got the variation and the differences. You've got the guys that would have been saying this is impossible and a stupid idea, and there's no need to do it. Why would you put a calf in a boat and then go over there? And then you've got the ones going, I'm going to do this, and nobody's going to stop me. So just by considering how they did that, you sort of get a picture, not an accurate or an academic one, but you get an idea of the variation in personality and I suppose the spectrum of differences that we see in people today.
Absolutely, and there would have been people that would have gone, I'm not going across that sea, and there would have been people that were like, I want to go and find out what's beyond the horizon, and I want to see why those particular kinds of cloud are gathering over there that looks like there might be an island beyond as far as we can see, and that kind of idea. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Different people as now would have existed, and some of them would have been adventurers or kind of different thinkers, and others would have been more stay-at-home people that liked what they knew. Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think there's all that even go even further with that, I suppose, in that people go through stages in their lives. I know when I was younger, I couldn't wait to get out. I wanted to go as far as I could and see what I could see, learn everything I could learn. These days, I'd much rather just sit at home with a cup of tea and read about it. And
exactly, me too.
Well, no, you've still got to go digging, Duncan.
I have, yeah.
Sorry. Well, I suppose we're here doing this. We're literally projecting our own thoughts on here. So another question we could just dive into quickly, perhaps, is how do archaeologists avoid projecting modern assumptions onto the past societies when interpreting the evidence? And this is really pertinent to this podcast because I'm literally doing that. Every episode I've done is, can we see neurodiversity there? And I'm not saying ADHD, autism, these are modern terms, but that variation in people's always been there. So, if you think about that, how do we avoid, how can we think about the past without thinking it from our own point of view?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the short first answer is we can't. We can only really understand the world through our own eyes, and we can't, magically make our brains be like someone who lived in the Bronze Age or something like that, because they would have just been operating in such a different context and had such a different life experience. But that doesn't mean that we can't try to imagine different ways of being and thinking. And, that's one of the main attractions of archaeology for me and for lots of people, I think, is that you get to imagine different ways of living in the world that are different to your own. And you might not necessarily aspire to those ways of living, but it's quite interesting to think of that possibility. And I think sometimes you find evidence that just doesn't quite make sense to our modern minds. Let's say in the Bronze Age, people burying loads of kind of valuable metal objects in the ground on purpose, maybe as some kind of offering, maybe as some kind of way of ensuring that the magic of metalworking continued, maybe because the landscape itself kind of demanded that they gave it something. There's lots of different reasons that we don't really know the right answer, but we can't imagine getting rid of something so valuable as that and just leaving it. But it made perfect sense to people in the Bronze Age, and it was a logical thing to do. And therefore, you're confronted by the archaeological evidence that makes you realise there are and were different ways of being in the world. And that's really good.
Absolutely. Yeah, great answer. Thank you, Duncan. Okay, Duncan, well, let's just spend a moment now thinking about archaeology. I mean, I myself hugely neurodivergent, and I've chatted with their friends in archaeology over the years, and I can't diagnose them, but I see a lot of similar traits in there. As far as I can see, archaeology is, as a field and as an endeavour, has such applicability to so many neurodivergent traits. I wonder if you could talk about that for a minute, how suitable archaeology is for neurodivergent listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. I think that, I work in a university, and so I teach students who want to learn about archaeology, and it's factually, statistically true that archaeology attracts a significantly higher numbers or proportions of students with neurodiversity than most other subjects. And that's always a great thing, bringing lots of different people into our community and our way of learning. And I think that people that have different ways of operating in the world and thinking about the world really benefit from the massively wide variety that archaeology as a subject in university, but also as a thing out there in the world offers. Because you can, everyone will have in their heads the idea of digging holes and finding, uncovering skeletons and that kind of thing. And certainly, that kind of hands-on activity is one of the things that we do. But archaeology goes miles in other directions as well. So you might not want the physicality of digging, but you might like finds, so you could go and work in the finds washing and analysing side of things. You might really like maths and statistics and things like that, and there'll be some areas of archaeology, pattern recognition that we touched on briefly earlier, that you need really good statistics for. Or you might enjoy scientific elements of things, so chemistry comes into it, biology, those sides of things. And then there's the much more kind of storytelling aspect, so perhaps you enjoy that side of things and making up stories and good interpretations, or thinking about kind of deep philosophical questions, and that comes into it as well. So I think archaeology as a university subject, but also just as a subject well beyond university, is so varied, more varied than almost anything else, and it brings all sorts of different things into it, and that can just suit lots of different kinds of people, and also allows different kinds of people to shine in all sorts of different ways, in the ways that they are able to shine. And that's great to see for our students and great to see for people that take part in archaeology as a whole.
I completely agree. Archaeology to me, I was never able to concentrate at school, but as soon as I got to university, the lectures, I was hyper in those lectures, and it was endlessly fascinating, whether we were talking about the ancient Mediterranean or early world hominids or the pottery or whatever. There was something somewhere that was just so damned interesting. And further up the academic ladder, from a degree to master's to PhD and so on, I met people who were focusing in on something so specialist, but to them it was endlessly fascinating, and there was always something they could discover in there. And I think the point I'm making there is, not only is archaeology just infinitely interesting, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of years, really, of material evidence, and we're looking at vast areas of subjects that give neurodivergent people the chance to find their special interest and explore that in huge detail, hyper-focused detail. But also, I wonder if you agree that neurodivergent archaeologists are incredibly useful in terms of contributing to archaeology, to our understanding of the past, just by that sometimes special ability to recognise patterns that others might miss. But just that different wiring, just seeing things differently, interpreting different differences, and seeing things from a different perspective. Do you agree with that, Duncan? The neurodivergent people can really benefit archaeology itself.
Absolutely. And I think that neurodivergent people make up a large proportion of the archaeological community, I suppose is the best word. And you're right, some particular tasks particularly suited to particular minds. The one that jumps to my mind is kind of refitting flint knapping sequences and stuff like that. And some people can just do that and love doing it. And other people, perhaps more like me, are useless at that and don't have the patience and don't have the kind of spatial awareness to do that. And I think that the existence of objects and things as a core element of archaeology is really helpful, because it just gives a different dimension to everyone's thinking. It's not just ideas, it's ideas in relation to things that are actually there in the world, and that creates a really interesting dynamic for lots of different ways of thinking to work with.
I agree, absolutely. And also, I'm going to also add in there, like this sort of autistic loyalty and love and passion that a lot of archaeologists have for their work. It is pretty plain to see as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That energy. Yeah, we go a little further than perhaps some people would. But yeah, Duncan, is there anything else you'd like to add at this point?
I don't think so. No, I think we're good. Yeah.
I think so. I think we've done really well there. So, yeah, Duncan, thank you so much for coming on and sharing so much with us for today. Hope you enjoyed it.
I did, and thanks for having me. I hope people enjoy hearing a bit about archaeology if they perhaps didn't know that much in the first place.
Absolutely. Let's hope so. I hope you guys found this episode helpful and can see a little clearer now how archaeology is helping humanity understand itself a little better. And of course, if you're like me, neurodivergent, that archaeology can give a sense of pride to our differences because, well, when we look at the past, we're not just looking at objects, are we? We're not just looking at tools or forgotten structures. We're looking at people. And then we're also seeing people thinking, experimenting, adapting, struggling, thriving in their environments. People like us with differences, trying to make sense of their world with, let's be honest, an inherited nervous system millions of years in the making. And then through archaeology, we get this incredible privilege of piecing together that shared human story. So yeah, thank you for listening, everyone, and I'll see you next time on ADHD BCE.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.